Mental Life, Conversations in Psychoanalysis. Conveying psychoanalytical thought simply.
Welcome. My name is Nuno Sousa Monteiro. I'm a member of the Portuguese Psychoanalytical Society and work in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in private practice in Lisbon. And I'm your host. My guest today is Dr. Robert Oelsner. He's a training and supervising psychoanalyst and psychotherapist working with children, adolescents, and adults. For more than 50 years, he has been working, teaching, and publishing in Argentina, the US, where he is a training supervisor of the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, and Europe. He is currently dividing his time between Buenos Aires and Berlin. Hello, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation to be here.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me. It was a kind surprise.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Same here.
And thinking about Donald Meltzer. And in today's episode, we're thinking about two Donald Meltzer's short passages recorded in supervision sessions. The first one concerning the importance of the analyst being kind, and the second one concerning the difficulties involved in accepting patients. Well, let us hear the first one.
One can be very meticulous about technique, but if you do that, then you behave in an inflexible and unkind way. My own preference is that kindness should take precedence over technical rigidity.
So listening to this very short passage, what comes to mind?
Well, I'm actually pretty excited listening to, on the one side, to Meltzer's voice. It reminds me of my many years having worked with him in Oxford, but also the topics. He introduces the idea of meticulousness versus kindness. And this is quite challenging and gives us a lot to think about. So here are my thoughts. First, in the young life of a psychoanalyst, psychoanalysts need to learn technique, which is typically taught in psychoanalytic institutes, perhaps nowadays not taken seriously enough, but technique and the mastering of it is just as important for psychoanalysts as it is for, say, pianists who want to become virtuosi. They first of all need to master technique. They need to know how to put the fingers on the keyboard. They need to know how to put their elbows. They need to know how to breathe while they are playing a piece. All that, and of course much more, belongs to technique, both in music and in psychoanalytic clinical work. Without technique, we would just be doing wild psychoanalysis, which Freud wasn't very friendly of, and no psychoanalyst, I think, that has had some serious training would agree that wild psychoanalysis has any role or any benefit in working with patients. Now, that said, the learning of the psychoanalytic technique takes quite some time in an analyst's life. I would say a couple decades probably, until you are fully acquainted with it. And technique has so much become part of your mindset when you're working that little by little it recedes to the background, to the back of your mind, and you don't need to keep thinking about it. It just becomes part of what you do. I think something similar happens with virtuosi in music that can bring their heart and their soul to a concert without having to think much about the position of the fingers or their elbows or the breathing. Mm-hmm. They just do it. Now, Meltzer says something quite interesting, that if you become too meticulous on technique, and he doesn't mean that you have to forget technique, but that you have to have had, this is now my saying, maybe Meltzer wasn't thinking about what I'm about to say when he spoke, that once you have mastered it enough, then the meticulousness is no longer one of your worries. Now, let us put it the other way around. If you are too worried about the correctness of your technique, you're going probably to miss something of the contact that your patient is trying to make with you, because the patient is trying to reach you and you are trying to be correct on technique, and concerned that you may commit a technical error, whatever a technical error may be. When Meltzer spoke of kindness, and by the year approximately that, he said that in the recording, he probably had already 40 or 50 years of clinical practice under his belt. And this is important to take into consideration, that an analyst that has several decades of experience has probably changed his mind of where he was in the first decade or in the first couple of decades of his professional work. I remember here a little quote that Betty Joseph once told us in a group when somebody asked her, "Betty, how did you get there?" And she responded, "Oh dear, when you will have 100 years of experience, like have I, then you're going to get there too." Which was not, I think, self-praise. I think what she meant is that as a psychoanalyst, you continue evolving if things go well, and if you are well analyzed and attuned to your work, you continue evolving, you never stop. This is also what I consider should ideally happen in the life of an analyst. It doesn't always, unfortunately. We see sometimes colleagues who had a good start, but over time seem to lose their ways, get confused with regards to the clinical work, and sometimes try to found a new way of doing psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. Well, that should alert us. That is not having turned your back to the meticulousness of the technique, but having had a conflict with the technique altogether and trying to find something that comes easier to you. Back to technique now. My view is that technique, and Meltzer has said that, I think, in one of the previous podcasts you published, that technique should assure us to create the setting. Mm-hmm. And setting is the foundation, I'd say, of technique. It's the most important part of technique. Without technique, you cannot do the work. Meltzer says that the setting, he said it in an earlier recording of yours, that the function of the setting is to facilitate the gathering of the transference. That is, that the transference is that when a patient first comes to analysis, have been deployed towards innumerable objects in the external world, little by little find their way to gather around the person and the personality of the analyst. When I say the personality, I mean the professional personality, the professional behavior of the analyst's capability of holding the frame and of being consistent with the elements of his work, such that the transferences come into the treatment, the patient trusting that the analyst will not act out or act in along with the patient, and therefore making it safe for the patient to bring his conflicts, his conflictual transferences, actually transferences like by nature conflictual, to the treatment. Now, what about kindness? It's an interesting concept, and kindness, to me, has not to be confused with trying to be nice to the patient, because that is already the beginning of an acting in the transference. Of course, we would all like to be appreciated, if not also loved, but by our patients. We would like to be very popular, particularly if we haven't worked through in our own analysis the matters of aggression, both of being the recipients of aggression or the actors of aggression. Therefore, kindness has very little to do in a firm psychoanalytic setting with trying to be nice or trying to be good, which would lead, as I said earlier, to become idealized by the patients.
It's the opposite, right?
Exactly.
Not in a seductive way, but
exactly.
I think Meltzer's idea was that kindness is a more profound and more mature thing within the therapeutic relationship, right?
I'm glad that you're mentioning this. You're asking it and saying it at the same time. Yes. The first act of kindness, which patients may not appreciate until they are at the very end of an analysis, if something like that exists at all, is the devotion the psychoanalyst has to the psychoanalytic method as some valuable way of relating to the sufferings of people and putting that at the disposition of the patients that are coming to get some relief for their unhappiness. Now, that is sheer kindness, because holding the frame is, particularly in the first years of analysis of a patient, a very challenging task. So much attempts at engaging the analyst into acting in the transference, enactments, the Kleinian analysts have called it, that it is a bit like sailing in a turbulent sea and trying to hold your route firm. Now, that is an act of kindness. The fact that an analyst is also agreeing to set apart in his schedule a number of hours every week to tend to one particular patient is also an act of kindness. That's not seductiveness, but patients often don't appreciate it, particularly when patients split off the kindness there is in your setting time apart, time of your life, time that you could devote to other patients, to one patient in particular, one patient at a time, is an enormous act of kindness. And patients may want to devalue that or to twist it and turn it into something like the analyst having some secret motives why he's practicing psychoanalysis, the most common of which is financial. The analyst does it because he gets some financial benefit. Now, true, we do get some financial benefit. After all, we can only do our work and devote ourselves to the profession if our maintenance is secured, if we have the money we need to make a living. Another misunderstanding is that analysts do that because they are very curious, and that psychoanalysis helps them to hide behind the couch or behind the professional attitude in order to satisfy their voyeuristic tendency. Well, that's also something important to consider. For once, we have to agree that if we were not curious, we wouldn't be able to do the work. Again, I think in the first podcast that you did, Meltzer speaks of interest, the analyst's attitude of interest. Now, where is the boundary between interest and curiosity? Actually, there is probably some, what would you call it, a degree between the one and the other, or we could call it healthy curiosity. Well, that is another problem that complicates the analyst's attitudes. And certainly, if we have gained some skill in understanding and managing the countertransference, we as analysts will be able to differentiate when our curiosity has become excited voyeurism and what of the patient has triggered that, in order to make a little bit of psychoanalytic introspection into our own mind and tendencies, and then get back to understanding what of the transference has elicited that. Mm-hmm. And here and there, it doesn't harm if we check on ourselves, maybe between sessions, maybe in our supervisions or in discussing clinical material with colleagues, to check in ourselves how we are doing with our interest and to what extent our curiosity is serving to get to know the patient for the benefit of understanding the patient, and in return, giving him the ability of broadening the patient's insight. So far, what I can say about kindness. Mm. Back to technique, which is such an interesting matter, is the breach of technique, which goes in a way on a par with technique. When is technique serving the furthering of the analytic work, which is mainly providing understanding and sharing understanding? And when is technique serving some other purpose? For instance, gratifying the analyst's seek of power over the patient, much in a way, sometimes parents find some pleasure in setting boundaries to the children beyond what is necessary, but more to gratify their being in power and being able to dictate to the children what they should not do and what they are allowed to do. Now, that would be just one example of a very subtle breach of technique, which may go on unnoticed for quite some time and belongs also to the analyst equation, which we call countertransference. When patients ask to change something in the setting as it is, say changes of duration of a session or changes in the schedule of the session, or bring in something, say patients bringing in a recording or wanting the analyst to listen to that, or photos or what, to what extent the analyst has to measure, is that for the benefit of the understanding of the patient, and to what extent is the patient trying to embattle the analyst's mastering of the setting, holding the setting. Now, these are breaches of technique that can only be discovered if the analyst has a firm enough technique. That's why I said that the first thing an analyst has to learn is technique, and within technique, the holding of the frame. And when the frame is being held, the analyst will also be in a good position to be sensitive to when the frame is about to get broken, either by the patient or by himself.
Mm-hmm.
And when the analyst is about to break the frame, it's more often than not an unanalyzed countertransference of the analyst that is getting in the way.
That can surface in the relationship through an unkind gesture or a lack of kindness, right?
Yes.
For instance, because your example of the pianist, I think it's very interesting because it's like the technique in musical ability, like you were saying, for at least a couple of decades to build up, and then in some way to forget about that. So it becomes natural. And I think, I don't know what you think about it, but we can only begin to talk about kindness after all that technique is already embedded in one's personality, as to become natural.
Exactly. I have found, but as I say, when I say that it takes some decades, I'm not trying to be arrogant. I'm actually disclosing that it took me a couple of decades, if not a little bit more, and I don't expect anyone to have to do it faster. Actually, if somebody would do it faster, I would get envious and say, why did it take me so long? And somebody else can do it faster. But I sometimes hear in supervisions that younger supervisees did commit some breach in technique, and they confess it in the supervision. If we have built up a trustworthy work relationship, they say, and then I did this or that, which I know that you, meaning me, would disagree with. And I typically am taken aback when I hear that in the mind of the supervisee, I would disagree with. And then I think to myself, what's the difference between what the supervisee did and what I would do? Well, I think nowadays the difference is that it just wouldn't cross my mind to do certain things that younger people still do. I don't need to make any effort to not do them. It just doesn't occur to me anymore.
Like the pianist, right? Like your example of the musician at the piano.
Exactly.
The hands go to the right places. And I don't mean always giving the correct interpretation, always 100%. Not in that sense, but in the
No.
sense that you were saying that effortlessly, in a way, the hands go like by themselves. And of course, that takes some decades, I would say. I'm sure you're right. I mean, like you were saying, if everything goes well, because they might not go well. Yeah, but that's
Exactly.
another issue. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you see, back to kindness, my need to explain what, in my thinking, kindness is not, is because kindness may be an equivocal term that may encompass part of what I think we should not be striving to do, and part of what hopefully we can to some extent do. The kindness lies in the attitude. The kindness is also that by the time we get to see a patient, if, as I would hope is mostly the case, we have made a promise to ourselves that we want to become better analysts by the day, that if we can in some way lay our aim of trying to become better every day on the lap of the patients, that is kindness. By the time we receive a patient or we listen to the patient, analysts have done a ton of homework in order to be able to do that work. You have had to have years of personal analysis, years of studying, years of understanding what you've studied and read, and years of supervision. It requires discipline, and that discipline is terribly important. If you want to do the work proper, there are some things that you have to do in your personal life as arrangements, such as to be in the best possible state when you receive a patient. You need to get enough sleep. You need to take care of that. If you're drowsy in the morning because you had a party the night before and had much fun and didn't sleep enough, then you have probably not done the arrangement that will get you to the session the next morning with the patient or your patients in the best state. That's discipline. And that's discipline that requires, as discipline does, a permanent watching and effort on yourself. Now, again, as I said about technique, once you have discovered the benefit of the discipline and that has become your way or part of your way of life, then you probably just do it because it's part of who you have become. And that, I think, is also overarching between the personal life and the professional life. There is not such a big difference. Your personal life has to have some sacrifice, some discipline, such that it doesn't get in your way of working with the patient or in the patient's way of trusting you. One frequent example is the problems that arise oftentimes between training analysts and candidates in the same institute. Sometimes, particularly if you were a member of a smaller institute, the overlap that is meeting your patients in meetings, in candidate analyst meeting and so on, is very hard to avoid. Still, you have to watch how you will manage that if you cannot avoid the meetings. In our extra-institute work, it's easier to avoid, but sometimes analysts do forget about that. And when it comes to, say, being the member of the same community, of the same club, or something like it, who's going to do what for the sake of protecting the psychoanalytic work, of protecting the privacy, of avoiding the breach of confidentiality and presenting yourself as an analyst too open, too much to your patient, that then feels hampered of bringing into you what he or she needs to bring in.
That would be unkind in the sense that we were...
Exactly. That would be unkind, meaning that kindness necessarily goes hand in hand with discipline, and the discipline of the analyst, as it is at the service of the patient, is kindness, but it may take a number of years for the patients to discover that and to say thank you.
And as it takes a certain number of years or decades for an analyst to first grasp that idea of kindness, it's complex. But that's after that whole musical training that you were, on your example, you meant, right? Yeah, it's very interesting.
Exactly. I love music. Unfortunately, like Donald Meltzer, I regret not having studied piano in my youth. But I still love listening to music. And I think there is a parallel between what it takes to become a virtuoso in music, and what it takes to become a virtuoso as an analyst. Both require discipline. Both require some inclination, some talent. Talent is terribly important. If you don't have a musical talent, you can't become virtuoso in music.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? Yeah. And if you don't have a talent to listen and understanding the unconscious, you cannot become a good analyst. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that you won't get certified as an analyst in an institute, which speaks to a matter that I also am very interested in, that is psychoanalytic education.
Mm-hmm.
That is, psychoanalytic institutes do not have the tools, and I don't blame them, there probably aren't any tools, to be able to tease out which applicants do have the talent and are worthwhile for the institute and for the applicant to devote some decades to try to become an analyst. And when the talent isn't there, and that person would be better served if he or she went into some other discipline.
Yes, I think that's an issue, and it has become a problem, I would say, over the years. From my perspective, it makes total sense. The mixture of some talent, it's a vocation. It's something that I would say has to be within us throughout our years of personal analysis that then grows in some way, right? And then
Exactly.
you have all that, again, comparison with the music, the musical exercises of the technique, but you have to combine both. It makes total sense to me what you just said, but it seems really difficult to solve that issue.
Exactly. Yes. Now, with hindsight, you can tell if you follow a supervisee, particularly in the lengthy time training supervisions take. They typically take 2 years, if not more, in most institutes. As a supervisor, over time, you can tell when your supervisee, the candidate, is talented and when you get a sense that it's useless. He or she will never get better, even if the supervision goes on and on and on. Those may, in the best of the cases, learn technique and rigidly hold on to technique because they just don't have what it takes to internalize technique for the benefit of doing the work and not for the benefit of just using technique as a seatbelt you put on in order to not get hurt when there is a crash. And boy, do we know in psychoanalytic treatment how often our psychoanalytic endeavor with a patient does crash. And how do we master that? How do we survive?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to Meltzer's words, if you stick too rigidly to technique, like you were saying, if all a person can do is to learn the technique, however diligently, if there's nothing else, probably that analyst will be doomed to be too rigid and hence without the possibility of being kind.
Exactly.
Like, again, Meltzer's words.
And here comes a little thought that I heard, was it Meltzer or Bion? I don't remember. I think it must have been Meltzer. Meltzer saying, isn't it a miracle that a patient comes back to the analyst session after session? What keeps the patient coming? And oftentimes, mostly I'd say, analysts that hold on too rigidly to the frame have patients like anybody else who keep coming for years.
Yeah. And what would you say is the answer to the question? I mean, what is the miracle on your perspective?
Yes, from my perspective, I think the miracle is the transference.
Yeah.
That is that the fact that the analyst does this or that, or is holding too rigidly to technique, or has already gone to the next step of evolution, doesn't do much to the gathering of the transference. And ultimately, I think the miracle is that transference processes keep happening. And that is what keeps the patients coming, that they have found in the analyst a well to quell their thirst and a repository for their transferences or projections. Now, how beneficial is that? In some instance, it does help patients in her or his daily life to have a place to go and to have a person that would be open to become a repository to their projections or projective identifications, as the British analysts like to call it, which I think is not very different from what in Freudian times was called just transferences. And it does do something. It has some benefit for the patients. And it clears up the rest of their lives out there, say their love life, their work life, and so on. In other cases, unfortunately, it becomes a waste of time and money. That is, analyses go on and on and on and on with very little changes. What Betty Joseph called psychic equilibrium, as opposed to psychic change. That is, the patient keeps coming, because with the existence of analysis and an analyst that is receiving what the patient has to bring, the patient feels better out there. But those analyses can never really end because they haven't done what it takes, promoting psychic change for the patient to mature and to be able to continue their introspection beyond the presence of the analyst and the existence of actual sessions.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Would you like us to progress the second segment, or
I would like to?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
definitely.
Let me play it for you.
I think in doing analytic work, one of the things you have to do is to put aside the whole question of liking and disliking, which is part of ordinary social relationships. I mean, if you stopped analysis with the people you dislike, you'd be throwing half of them out. My experience teaches me that I wouldn't today accept some of the patients I did accept 20 years ago. Much more alert to what I would now call the psychopath, the liar, the deceiver, the trickster, and so on.
Well, another very interesting passage, and the joke about, well, in his words, we would throw half of the patients out if we were just attached to the notion of liking or disliking the person. What do you think of that?
Well, in earlier times, Meltzer told me, I was there in his office, that he did never choose his patients, that he would take a patient on an analysis if he had the time available to see the patient. That was it. The rationale was that he thought it was a democratic, this is my words now, he was a democratic way of trying to be fair and giving every patient a chance to be analyzed. Now, in this recording, he said that he had changed, that 20 years on from the times that he would just take anyone in if he had the time, there was a certain category of patients he would not take in. And he said, what did he say? He said psychopaths, liars, tricksters, and deceivers, right? Well, this is a very good point. And certainly, if we are on the receiving end of patients that would make us analysts the target of psychopathic acting outs or of lies and trickiness, why would we want to do that? I tend to believe, hearing this passage of Meltzer, that what he's saying is that there is a certain range of patients that do not benefit from the psychoanalytic methods. And therefore, it's both a waste of time for the analyst to invest himself in treating them, but, and this is again my words, that there is this category of patients that he enlisted that may really harm the mind of the analyst. And our tool is, first and foremostly, our mind. Part of our discipline, going back to what we spoke before, part of our discipline is to try to protect our minds, to keep our minds in the best possible state, such that we have the instrument available to treat those patients who can make a good use of what we have to offer. The category of patients that Meltzer must be referring to must be those who come to harm the analyst's mind, consciously or unconsciously. The problem is that oftentimes we don't know that when a patient first comes in, and it may take quite a while until we realize it. And what do we do then if, say, after a year or two, you find yourself in an impasse or a negative therapeutic reaction with a patient who is proving his superiority over the analyst's effort to make a difference in the patient's life? At that point, it's already too late because you already have made a choice, and precisely you have been tricked, you have been lied, and it causes certainly some feeling of humiliation for an analyst to realize that little did he know who he was taking in. And then you find yourself at a fork in the road, that you would feel inclined to terminate the treatment, but then you hear something like, say, suicidal threats if the patient is being abandoned. And what do you do then? You don't want to terminate a treatment and then find that the patient committed suicide on your watch or killed somebody on your watch, right? So what do you do? I don't have a solution for that. I'm just saying that this is a problematic matter. And what Meltzer says is also an ideal. Now, of course, if he was thinking that he could, in some cases, and maybe in some cases you can, detect early on the unhealthy disposition of the patient that probably will never make a work alliance with you, then you would just not take the patient in. Well, that's easy cheesy, isn't it? You know that, you decide you don't want to take the patient, you say that you have to excuse yourself, and that's the end of the story. Now, if the patient is a successful psychopath, he will manage to get himself into your practice and to make you believe that you should be happy having him or her. And then you're stuck. But it belongs to our professional lives to sometimes have to deal with these kinds of patients. Now, I'm not saying that any patient is entitled to have some mythomanic, lying, trickiness, or psychopathic trends. Any patient is entitled to have that as part of his personality and bring it in. The problem is when that changes the aim from the point of view of the patient of psychoanalysis, while the aim of the analyst is to be able to do his work and to find in the patient enough of a cooperation, work alliance, that you can keep working with the patient.
I know you don't have like an established method, the solution to offer, but what would you do?
Every case is different. I have lived and worked back in Argentina during the entire times of the military dictatorship, also called the terrorism of the state. Now, those were terrible times and certainly dangerous times for analysts. A number of colleagues belonged to the 30,000 that disappeared in Argentina, that were just taken away into clandestine concentration camps, killed or thrown to the River Plate. Those were challenging times. I knew one thing, that is that I would not have been able to take a military who killed other people into my practice. I just wouldn't have been able to do that. Fortunately, it didn't happen. I did have in my practice back then a couple of young students who belonged to what the militaries called the terrorists within the state that justified them, they thought, to go on just skipping the law and kidnapping and killing anyone that was even a suspect. Now, that led me to another problem. That is, I was being at risk in treating those patients with whom politically I agreed, I sympathized with. But I was a younger analyst, I had a family, and I had also to protect them. So it was too risky for me to be even keeled on treating them when I didn't know if at any point the patient might disappear. My name might have been in one of their notebooks, contact books. By then, we didn't have, like nowadays, computers or cell phones. And then I would be next in line, and the militaries would come after me and after me to my family. So some of those patients, I found a way to make sure that they would survive. That is, to interrupt their analysis and make it clear to them that the military dictatorship and the danger that we were all running would come to an end, that these things don't last forever, and that if we stop now to save both the patient and myself, the analysis would be able to be resumed if we survived later on. In one of the cases, this is exactly what happened. I managed to send the patient way out of the country. And a few years later, when the patient found out that his records had been cleared, although the military dictatorship was close to ending but wasn't over, the patient came back. His analysis was resumed exactly where we left it. I think it was 2 or 3 years earlier, and carried to an end. That was not the case with another patient who I never heard again, and I was very uneasy thinking that he might have been on the list of people that disappeared. Lo and behold, some 7 years later, I meet this guy in the street. I am walking on the sidewalk in one direction, he is coming in the other. He walked just by me. He didn't recognize me or didn't even look at me, but I immediately spotted him and knew who he was. I just decided not to stop him because I thought that if he had wished, he was free to contact me if he wanted to, and he was also free to ignore me if he couldn't forgive me for having not made the personal sacrifice and having interrupted his treatment nevertheless. Now, this doesn't respond to your question, but I will try to make it fit still.
No, it responds to something I would say very important. It has to do with this issue. Shall I interrupt the treatment with this person or not? Or can I take this person A instead of that person B? We have those issues on our table, so to speak. Because I was thinking, some way, an overlapping of these two segments that we heard. I was thinking that, like, we don't take patients because we like them, or we don't send patients away because we dislike them. It has to do, in a way, with that same notion of kindness, to keep on being attentive and interested in that person, even though we can dislike them, because it's not a matter of liking or disliking. Our work is not about liking or disliking. in the same way that it's not to be seductive or to be nice to patients, and the patients making us feel very good people because they like us.
Yep.
So I don't know. I was thinking about all this. Of course, you responded the question with going further in the importance and sometimes the difficulties involved in interrupting a treatment.
Well, if we want to keep to Meltzer's work, I'm sure you know Meltzer's article on the technique of interruption of an analysis in the case of an impasse. It's a chapter in one of his books. This again is related to interruption, and for the analyst to avoid, to himself and to the patient, to go on and on and on with a treatment that is seemingly going nowhere. At that point, Meltzer found that setting a time to terminate the treatment did mobilize forces in the patient and transferences such that something could still be achieved in the time between the analyst unilaterally announced the ending of the meetings and the time that these meetings would actually end. The trickiness of the matter, and I gather that's why, other than Meltzer, none of the British analysts adopted that technique, is that under menace of getting the treatment interrupted, patients may all of a sudden become very cooperative. But the forces that led to an impasse will not go away. So it's only temporary. And it's technically important that once the analyst has made the thoughtful decision to communicate to the patient that he will or she will stop meeting with the patient, you have to do it. You can't say that you will do it and then you don't do it. That would certainly be an error of technique, which is why an analyst would have second thoughts about adopting that technique. But at a certain point, these matters cannot be avoided. And ultimately, if we go back to the categories that Meltzer described, the psychopath, the liar, the trickster, and so on, if you find yourself caught in that trap, you need to interrupt the treatment, not necessarily to benefit the patient, but to prevent your mind from getting corroded or eroded, and then you're finding it difficult to get back to the other set of patients you have that you have some commitment to. Now, those patients who have the kind of organization Meltzer was speaking of, and to those who understand or are knowledgeable in Bion's theories of the positive and the negative links, those patients that Meltzer enlisted are under the spell of what Bion called -K. And patients who are strongly entrenched in -K, that is an opposition to getting to know, turning into an opposite, an extreme of which is lies, for instance, as opposed to interest in truth. Some of those patients who found, say, in lies, psychopathy, and so on, a psychic equilibrium may have a breakdown, the severity of which an analyst cannot know beforehand, which does show that our profession is a very difficult profession, if not an impossible profession, as Freud once said. In some instances, it's not always an impossible profession, but it is very challenging for sure. I think as analysts, we also need to be humble enough to accept the limitations of our methods as well as our personal limitations. A patient may not be having a successful analysis with one analyst, but if referred to another analyst, things may go better. Freud himself, as we know, he referred the Wolfman to a female analyst because he thought he would be doing better with a female analyst than with a male analyst. I don't know what the outcome of that was, but Freud was modest enough to not mind having to accept that he, Freud, would not be able to cure everyone. And we know physical doctors or surgeons do know that they might not be able to save a patient's life from cancer. In some instances, it may happen. In other instances, it doesn't. And the fact that a patient with cancer dies on the watch of a surgeon doesn't make the surgeon a bad doctor. It only speaks about the limitations with our science nowadays, what surgery or the medical profession can do. And we need to be modest enough to accept that too. In which case, terminating a treatment might be coming across not as refusal of seeing the patient because we don't like him or her, or worse, as a punishment, but as an acceptance of our limitations and the limitations of psychoanalysis, and allowing the patient to have another attempt at psychoanalysis with somebody else he or she chooses, if the patients want to do that.
So, on one hand, identifying some issues in the patient that may result in forcing us, so to speak, to end the treatment. And on the other hand, our own limitations, which are, I think, ever present in some way or another, and sometimes refer the patient to somebody else, or at least somebody that's not us. So
Exactly.
freeing the person from feeling obliged to carry on working with us.
Exactly.
Because like you were saying, that sometimes the treatment has that equilibrium, but that nothing really changes.
Exactly.
Technically an analysis, but it's not really an analysis.
Well, this belongs to a category that has been forgotten over time, that is pseudo-analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I think Meltzer, when he was young, in his very early writings that probably didn't make it into any of his books, but I did hear him say that or write it, that category of pseudo-analysis, that is, everything looks like an analysis, except that the truth is missing, the essence of psychoanalysis is missing, the emotionality is missing, where it is keeping the appearance of an analysis. Let me insert now a little bit of Bion here again, and this is my application of two of Bion's ideas, that is the other two links, that is minus L and minus H, meaning negative love and negative hate, which interestingly enough, minus L is not hate and minus H is not love. It is just that both are an exoskeleton with no content in it, an appearance of love without the essence of love, that is the emotion, or the appearance of hate without the emotion of hate. Well, that leads, or the same could be said about minus K, that is the appearance of being curious and interested without the emotion of wanting to know, striving to know. Now, that much leads to pseudoanalysis that have all the elements of psychoanalysis without the substance of it, without the essentials. And if we go back now to what experience has taught me about training analysis, in some instances, training analyses are just about that they may have all the appearance of an correct analysis. The candidate, because he wants to be in the good graces of the institute and of the training analyst as a representative of the institute, does everything right in order to be a quote unquote good patient. And the analyst gets bored to death because there is nothing to work with. It's just an appearance of, it's a pseudo-analysis.
Well, do you think that a senior analyst should stop the treatment?
That's a very, very hard question. It's a mean question of you, actually, to challenge me on that. I'm joking. But it's a hard question because what do you do? This is another one of those forks in the road where you're damned if you do or you're damned if you don't. What do you do? I will tell you here another little anecdote with Meltzer in it. When Meltzer came to my institute in Buenos Aires, I don't know, this must be 40 years ago probably, I was a very fresh training analyst. I was actually the youngest training analyst in my institute by then, and was allowed to attend the meeting of just the training analyst with Meltzer. In that time, Meltzer had just resigned, actually had just left his membership in the British Psychoanalytic because of many critiques he had about them, and actually because the establishment, was severely at odds with what Meltzer was doing and practicing by then. He had recently moved to Oxford, and he blasted against training analysts and training analyses, which was very courageous of him because the meeting was with just training analysts. And we were all training analysts, and he was saying that he didn't believe in that. And I remember I shyly raised my hand for the sake of making myself visible with the seniors and said, so I have a question. Hearing what you said, what are the chances of training analysis at all? And he shook his head and he said, there is just no hope. Just imagine him saying that to, say, we were 30 or 40 training analysts. Now, again, I think his was a blanket statement, and he wanted to, in a way, to shake up the establishment, our establishment in Buenos Aires, that was very friendly to him, but we were still an establishment. In my personal analysis, I had the luck to have my analysis with a senior analyst who was not, when I started with him, a training analyst. It was just a true analysis. My analyst by then alerted me that since he was not a training analyst and I might like to apply to become training analyst, I might want to search for a training analyst. And I said, look, before I ever can dare to apply to a psychoanalytic institute, I first need to get cured. No psychoanalytic institute would want to accept me as sick as I am now. So I need to get my analysis first, and then we can talk. and I had a true analysis. Now, some 2 or 3 years into my analysis, I learned from my supervisor then that my analyst had become a training analyst, which my analyst hadn't told me because I said I wasn't interested in that. So I went back and said, well, I heard you just became a training analyst. Sometime after that, I got a letter from the Institute saying that I could apply to the Institute. And since I was already in analysis with a training analyst, actually a new training analyst, I could get started. I said no. I mean, I just didn't go. I didn't apply. I waited for another year because I found that I wasn't mature enough to go there. My analyst then interpreted to me, I remember, my resistance to go into doing the psychoanalytic training. I listened, but I still waited a whole year before I applied. Years later, it must have been 20 years after my analysis had finished with him and I met him, I reminded him of that and I said, look, there is one big misunderstanding you made. You never trusted me when I said that I wasn't ripe, I wasn't feeling ripe to apply to the Institute. You thought it was a resistance, whereas I thought and still think it was my immaturity. I needed more analysis before I could get there. So in that regard, I would certify that my analysis was very hopeful, but it was probably exceptional in that it started not as a training analysis, and I didn't want a training analysis then. And then I became a candidate, and then I became a very young training analyst over time, you see. My analyst, he made some inclination that maybe now we could become friends. And I said to him, that will never happen. You will be my analyst for life, whether you want it or not. We can't be friends. We can be friendly, but the category of friends would actually stop me for the rest of my life to hold you in my mind as my analyst. And I want to hold you in my mind that way. Now, you probably read a lecture that Meltzer gave somewhere. It's published somewhere. I think McHarris published it. Well, Meltzer goes back to his early history with Melanie Klein. Meltzer was stationed, I think, in Germany. He was very young, and he said in that lecture that he went to his superior and said, you need to let me go. I need to get to London to get analysis from Melanie Klein, or I will kill somebody.
I didn't know that last part.
Oh, yes, he said, or I would kill somebody. And he went to Melanie Klein, and that analysis became also his training analysis. But he didn't go to Melanie Klein because he wanted to become an analyst, but because he thought that he so badly needed analysis. And it was the end of the war, that if he didn't get analysis, and it had to be from Melanie Klein, now God knows where Meltzer, who was American by birth, did hear about Melanie Klein, but certainly he had read something and that said something to him. Now, my analyst was not Melanie Klein and I'm not Meltzer, but over time, thinking back of my bad need of getting analysis, I could re-signify what Meltzer meant when he said, I need to get analysis from Melanie Klein or I will kill somebody. Well, I thought that I needed to get analysis from a senior analyst that would understand me, or I just wouldn't be able to go on living. Mm-hmm. And it entirely blew me up and changed my life. Yeah. But I expected that to happen. That's why I wanted to get analysis. Yeah. I wasn't surprised. Well, I could go on and on and on, you know. As we're talking, your proposal with the excerpts by Meltzer, the fragments, and your thoughts are enormously stimulating. And that's why I say when my mind gets stimulated, then with analysis, the same things happen, don't they? A good analysis doesn't finish literally, but it stimulates in the analysand the wish to get to know more, and the analysand then to continue doing the work of understanding himself, of listening here and there to his actions, to his thoughts, to his dreams, if he can recall them, and not to finish because the meetings with the analyst finishes. Opposite to that, there is again a problem with many training analyses where candidates are mandated by the institute to complete a number of hours, which in some institutes, particularly in America, have been lowered and lowered. It's always less and less hours that candidates have to comply with. And then candidates feel happy that they have completed the hours, but who wants to make of the completion of the hours the aim of an analysis?
Well, nobody should, I think. I would agree with you. Nobody should want that, should be interested in that, the completion of the hours. That doesn't make any sense. It brings us back to that, the idea of the pseudo analysis. It's not truthful, right?
Exactly. And it may be terribly disappointing if after some number of years you learn at the end of the work that the patient was watching the hours, counting the hours, and you didn't know about that.
I'm sure that can be very disappointing, very frustrating. I can imagine.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience, a patient, this was back in Buenos Aires many years ago, and it was very difficult to get anywhere. But at a certain point, the patient told me that she had completed the hours and she was wanting to end the treatment. Well, I couldn't hold her back from doing that if that's what she wanted. Now, in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, when analysands enter analysis, it's sort of traditional that they would give the analyst some gift. Now, guess what this patient gave me?
What?
A clock for my desk.
Well, that's really funny. That's
Well, there you go. That's what you get back. It's thrown in your face that the patient has been counting the hours and you didn't notice it.
Yeah.
Very disappointing.
I'm sure it was, yeah.
Well, we aren't safe from that, are we?
So, Dr. Oelsner, I wanted to thank you very much once again. It was very, very interesting. It was great to have you here.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a total pleasure, actually.
Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Mental Life. Conversations in Psychoanalysis.